For this presentation, I'd like to give a brief overview of monasticism, which I'm actually going to do in two parts. The first part here will deal with events leading up to the origins of Benedictine monasticism, and then the second one will cover Benedictine monasticism all the way up to the time of St. Francis. So let's begin by talking about what we're talking about. Now, the central feature of monasticism, this is a Christian religious movement, essentially is this. It's really a form of withdrawal from society into some kind of community or individual situation where one can live a religious life untouched, if you will, kind of by the world. Now, its origins are in what is now modern-day Egypt, and it actually emerges in about the 3rd and the 4th century. You begin to see some of these things emerge in Egypt. Now, what had happened before this time is that Christians had been in the Roman Empire, and in many cases they had been oppressed. In some cases, they'd even been killed and martyred. So martyrdom was considered the way to really have the best Christian experience. It made you very much like Jesus. You died a death that was sacrificial or that was unmerited, and so therefore you were very much like Jesus. So this was the way to live the Christian life, was to become a martyr. But once Christianity became legalized by the Romans, in fact, they had to find other ways to lead the Christian life. And so you see these what are called ascetic movements. And these are movements where people began to make commitments to live life of virginity or life of a life of denial of the body, so they would fast a lot and so on. So fasting, for instance, becomes an important aspect of how one lives the Christian life. And of course, this is based right out of Matthew 4 and Luke 4, where Jesus goes out in the desert and fasts and prays. So the desert also becomes an important aspect of this. Where the origins are. Now, the most famous of the early Christian monks was a guy named St. Anthony. Now, he was inspired by this verse from Matthew 19:21, which you can see here, where Jesus says to give everything away and then go follow Jesus. Now, he decided to live what's called an eremitic life, okay, or the life as a hermit. So he would retreat out to a cave in the desert, and he would pray and fast, and so on. And this became an important way of thinking about how one lived the life as a monk. Now, there was a guy, a very famous theologian actually, named Athanasius, who writes a story about Anthony. It's called The Life of Anthony. And this becomes really the famous way of understanding early Christian monasticism. He talks about Anthony's miracles, how people came to follow him, and so on. In fact, we also know that later on, St. Augustine will read Athanasius' book about Anthony, and this would be one of the things that inspires him to go on and be a Christian life. Now, another way of being monastic was invented by another Egyptian monk named Pachomius. Now, he developed what's called Cenobitic monasticism, and this is basically, instead of being out individually, this is a communal form of monasticism. So where St. Anthony would go off into a cell or a cave by himself, Pachomius would gather a series of monks together. They would have cells and caves, but they would actually live close together. They would gather together for Eucharist and worship on a regular basis. So it's much more a communal form. And here, the biblical inspiration is Acts 2:42 through 47, which you can read this. And this talks about how the early apostles lived together. They gave everything away. They would keep things in common, and so on. Now, what you've got then is two different kinds of forms of monasticism, that of St. Anthony and that of Pachomius, one of individual and one of communal. And what you're going to see is, in the cases, for instance, of St. Francis, is that this tension actually takes place in his own life. He forms a group of people, but towards the later part of his life, he tends to want to be more of a hermit. So you'll see that these two different ways of expressing monastic life actually come to fore in Francis's life. And so this there for Francis. He spends a lot of time wanting to be alone, and yet a lot of time being in community. Now, what happens in monasticism, the growth of monasticism, is it makes its way from Egypt into Italy. So you see people like Jerome and Ambrose and others take up forms of monasticism, and we'll get to the particular form of that Benedictine monasticism, which also starts in Italy, in our next video. Augustine, like I said, had read the life of St. Anthony, but he also creates his own rule, Augustinian rule, and his was primarily not for lay people, but for communities of priests. One of the things that I should have mentioned with regard to Pachomius and to Anthony is that theirs was really a lay movement, people who weren't priests. Augustine creates a way for priests to live in community together. So Augustine is Roman, really, but he actually operates in North Africa, but he's very much actually influenced by developments in Italy. In Gaul, which we now think of as France, a very influential monk, John Cassian, comes to work there. He actually spends time traveling in Egypt and learning from the desert monks there. We think he probably knew Anthony. He writes, based on his experiences, 2 important books, one, The Institutes, and one, The Conferences, that become very influential. He talks about his stories of Egypt, and in fact we'll see that St. Benedict picks up and references these 2 as being really key texts for people to understand monasticism. So this is the early shaping of monasticism. This stuff will have important ramifications for Francis as well, and we'll talk about how that develops a little bit in our next series of slides.